Hi, my name is Katie, and today we're going to be talking about climate refugees. Specifically, my research question is, given that developed Western nations in the global north have contributed to climate change via greenhouse gas emissions, who is responsible for the people in developing nations who have been displaced as a result of climate shocks? Throughout this video, I will focus primarily on the African nations. First, we need to discuss who is a refugee. Currently, in order to be classified as a refugee by the United Nations, one must demonstrate a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. A refugee is someone who has crossed international borders and has been awarded refugee status. If someone flees within the country borders, they're considered internally displaced persons. Why is this important? Persons fleeing climate disasters and stresses do not meet any of these thresholds. The Refugee Convention was created somewhat hastily, focusing on state persecution of individuals in post-war Europe after World War II, and was applied globally and permanently in 1967 without modification. The convention was simply a reaction to events of the time and place and has not been modified to fit modern standards of refugee. The standards at the time also focused on repatriating people to countries when it was deemed safe to return. Additionally, climate refugees are unique in that we cannot repatriate people to lands that may, 1, no longer exist due to erosion, or 2, are literally not habitable for humans. There are 3 main lenses through which I view the issue of climate refugees. The first is morality and ethics, the second is political philosophy, and the third is precedent of the Refugee Convention and its applications. For morality and ethics, our question essentially is the duty of countries to only the citizens within their borders or to humanity as a whole? And does the Western world owe what amounts to reparations to the less developed nations that have suffered at the hands of our industrialization? Historically, the poorest countries have accepted the most refugees. Mostly due to geography, 73% of refugees are hosted in neighboring countries and 85% are hosted in other developing nations. So who is at fault here? There is some suggestion that countries who contribute the most to climate change should accept the most refugees, but I think that's overly simplistic and it's more complicated than that. First, there is the argument that countries who outsource should own the emissions of those countries. So, for example, if the United States outsources something to China or India, causing emissions from a factory, we should own those emissions. There are also historical implications leading to the underdevelopment of nations, particularly African nations. The United States and Europe have a long history of exploitation of the African continent. The USA is notorious for the slave trade, and Europe has a long history of colonization, which lasted until 1980 when Zimbabwe gained its independence. To this day, we benefit from exploiting resources of African nations. Not only have these nations contributed little towards global warming, but they've been robbed of resources. There's also the consideration of pollution, where developed nations literally utilize African nations as a dumping grounds, particularly in electronics or e-waste in Western Africa. We can also look to political philosophers here for some ideas on the treatment of refugees. In the 1500s, Bartolomé de las Casas had argued against the Spanish colonization of the American Indian population. Philosopher Immanuel Kant also had similar viewpoints, though he advocated for needing consent to reside somewhere. However, that doesn't mean that you need consent to move to a country. His viewpoint was more in an effort to avoid colonialism. Other Enlightenment era thinkers of the 1700s to 1800s endorsed a social contract theory. While refugees' laws focus on persecution, the social contract would focus on protection of people. The responsibility to protect has been discussed by the United Nations as recently as 2005. The Refugee Convention and its applications. As discussed earlier, people fleeing from climate disasters don't meet the criteria to be a refugee and offered the international protections that come with the refugee status. However, is it not a human rights violation to be sent back to a country that is either flooding or drying out and where there's not enough food and water to sustain life? There are potentially some people fleeing disasters who can maybe return, but others may need permanent refuge. The definition of refugees has not been updated to meet the current world. This is yet one of the many examples of the Western world only viewing refugees through the lens of politics instead of humanity, and standing by and waiting for someone to step up. So who is responsible? Australian think tank IEP predicts that up to 1.2 billion people could be displaced by climate by the year 2050. Stating that countries who have emitted the most greenhouse gases should be responsible for taking in the most refugees, as I mentioned, is overly simplistic for a couple of reasons. The first being, examining the historical total of greenhouse gas outputs is important. Second, the amount of wealth a country has gleaned by way of mining natural resources for their own benefit is another factor to examine. How much wealth did the West steal from particularly African nations, thus blocking development in those countries in question? And how much waste did the West dump, forcing their locals to use their time and skills to clean up? Third, the size of a country with the amount of available land for living needs to be considered. If we proposed a resettlement simply on emissions and amount of livable space, the United States would become responsible for the vast majority of refugees. But if you look at the amount of wealth extracted from a country, that may tip the scales slightly towards European countries accepting more refugees due to their long history of colonialization and not putting back resources into Africa after taking them out. Next, some people escaping climate disasters may be able to resettle within their own country. These people would be considered internally displaced and not refugees. However, this needs to be taken into consideration when deciding how much space a country has available for relocation. A famous example of this would be Hurricane Katrina in the United States. These victims were essentially, climate migrants, climate refugees, but they didn't have to leave their own country, so they were internally displaced. Many settled into another state. The climate disasters forthcoming in the United States is likely to displace many more people within the country, whereas many countries in the European Union enjoy a climate that is generally less vulnerable to climate change than the African continent. Examining this piece may also tip the scales in favor of European nations accepting more refugees. It is also important not to create too much stress within host nations by moving too many people at once. Countries more open to a change could accept a greater number faster. Researchers would need to examine past resettlement patterns aligned with social resistance to provide a number of refugees that can be settled within a given area at once, while creating the least social unrest. At the end, the researchers could combine all of these factors mentioned above with the rate of climate change in each country and the population wanting to relocate over the next few decades. Priority of resettlement, of course, would go to areas of countries that are most likely to suffer the biggest climate threats. An extensive formula could be worked out determining each country's global responsibility toward climate refugees.